Good morning. My name's James Stanger, and this video is one of my continuing series on IVF culture. This one is looking at the effects of pH on embryo development. It's based on an article that was published just recently in RBM Online, and looking at the effects of embryo culture medium pH on live birth rates after IVF ICSI, a double-blind, multi-center randomized trial. But before we start, I'd just like to make a point. I'm starting to do this for every video now. There are thousands of articles published on IVF each year, and I review them every night, ones that I think are important. And I try and do one video at least once a week on topics which I think may be important either to IVF clients coming through. So if you're a patient, I think these videos should be of interest to you, but also to IVF staff and the laboratory staff in particular. And I also like to make a point that I have this promotional notice board. If you have a company or an organization or a clinic you'd like to promote on my video site, please contact me. I'll be happy to discuss with you promoting your product. Okay, enough of that rubbish. Let's go down to the topic at hand, which is the effect of media pH on embryo development. So there's been a lot of work done on this over the years, but still rather is controversial. And now this video is a short video just on the topic, but I'm going to make another one just shortly after this, which is the extended, which takes the concept of role of pH into a far greater level. So this is just a short video on the results. Okay. So the pH of culture media, the external one, PHE, is one of the very basic elements of the IVF culture media, since all enzyme reactions are pH dependent. And in fact, the first mouse embryos that were grown back in the 50s it was the adjustment of pH, which is one of the key things. And it came about because the initial mouse embryos that they were collected, this is 1950, so very, it's almost 100 years ago, almost 70 years ago. And but the embryos never grew. But they had some embryo culture system where there was a fungus growing. Obviously, their sterility was not as good as today. And that changed the pH. And suddenly all these embryos started to grow in amongst all the fungal rhizomes. And so that was the first time where they realized that the pH of the media needed to be a lot lower than the normal 7.4, 7.6 of most culture systems. So that's a little bit of an aside. So the pH of the external culture media is one of the most basic elements of the IVF system, since all enzyme reactions are pH dependent. The oocyte and the early embryo are far more vulnerable to inappropriate pH than later stages. And indeed, the really important thing from amino acids, including glutamate, was the addition of glutamate to the oocyte-containing media was the one thing that doubled the pregnancy rate back in the early 90s from about 15% to about 30%, purely because the oocyte is so vulnerable to the pH at ICSI or IVF, and that it has very few mechanisms to protect it, and therefore understanding the right pH of the embryo is really critical. I'll talk about it in my second video when I upload it in a couple of days. It's generally acknowledged that the pH of fertilization is higher than for embryo cleavage, and the pH is thought to be optimal about 7.2. For fertilization, 7.4. In fact, my PhD on mouse embryos back in 1977, when I first started working on mouse embryos, the first thing I defined was that optimal pH for fertilization of mouse embryos was 7.45, and 7.2 it only worked about half the rate. But the interesting thing is it's really important for the acrosome reaction to be slightly more alkaline. But once the embryo starts to divide, I thought the optimal pH is about 7.2. If the external pH is not optimal, then the theory is that the embryo needs to expend more additional energy to regulate the internal pH, PHI, and in so doing diminish its potential for pregnancy. So this, I think, is the reason why the pH is so wrong, is not good, is the embryo has to work harder to maintain the internal pH that it wants, and has to do that by expending its energy reserves. However, the ability to manipulate the pH externally dynamically is not currently possible in the time-lapse systems where the dual culture media has been replaced with a universal media for continuous assessment. And the current pH of culture media is largely similar in all the different manufacturers, but they're not exactly the same. And so you can have a slightly different pH by using a different media. And sometimes this is really hard to work out what it is. And I probably should do another video on that sometime later, but I'm kind of sick of working with different media. I think we need some more innovative media in the marketplace. But in fact, the only way you can really manipulate it in your own clinic is by adjusting the CO2 atmospheric incubator. And as you know, the pH of culture media is primarily regulated by the balance of CO2 concentration supplied by the incubator and by the concentration of bicarbonate in the media. Because bicarbonate concentrations are set by the commercial suppliers of the media, it's easiest to adjust the CO2 concentration in the incubator to get the pH that you want. So basically, adding more CO2 will lower your pH, and lowering your CO2 will raise the pH. So if you think the media is too alkaline, you can increase it from 5 to 5.5. If you think it's too acidic, you want to make it slightly more alkaline, then you can do it by lowering your pH. And quite frankly, I like to have in the old days when we used to have phenol red in the medium, I used to always love mine, put my pH is just between, just a lovely pink color. There we go. Okay. Under the conditions of IVF embryo culture, the CO2 in the incubator dissolves in the media to form carbonic acid. Therefore, the pH in the external of the culture media is a result of a balance between CO2 concentration in the incubator and the bicarbonate concentration in the media. The embryologist can adjust the pH by modifying the CO2 levels in the incubator. Monitoring CO2 and the pH, external pH, is part of the best practice in IVF as outlined by the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology Guidelines, but the required external pH have been set arbitrarily, but you can change it as long as you can justify it. Worldwide, most IVF laboratories spend time and money monitoring the pH of culture media without any clinically demonstrated human data on the ideal pH to apply. Randomized clinical trials are therefore required to establish what the pH value is the desired one to maintain. And the primary object of this paper, of the present study, was to measure through multicenter double-blind randomized trials the effect of two pH values in IV culture media at both roughly ends of the spectrum, 7.2 and 7.34, on the live birth rates after IVF. The secondary objectives were to evaluate the effect of pH media on fertilization and early development, as well as in vitro developmentability. So the design was a multi-center randomized controlled double-blind trial conducted in 3 centers in Spain. Basically, this is one of the problems of this paper. This is all ICSI only going to day 3. So this test is only looking at microinjections, got nothing to do with the acrosome reaction or the function of spawns, purely and simply to do with how the oocyte manages the processing of the sperm fertilization and the early cleavage, and only goes to day 3. This is the stage when the embryo is most vulnerable and has nothing to do with looking at the pH of a blastocyst, which is thought to be far more acidic, rough 7.2, whatever. Overall, 420 women aged 40 or less undergoing their first or second fresh ICSI cycles with their own eggs were between 20 and 23. However, disappointingly, the recruitment stopped before the planned sample size was reached because of feasibility constraints. However, the randomization one-to-one occurred right from the day start. The pH was measured daily using a validated method under routine IVF culture conditions, and the primary outcome was live birth rates per oocyte pickup. And this is the data. So they had a pH that was set at 7.22, another one set at 7.38. So obviously had 2 different incubators in each of the different labs, and they ran these in a randomized way. But the fertilization rate, this is for ICSI, remember, it's not for IVF, and so you want to make sure that when you're interpreting this paper and this video, we're only talking about ICSI, and the concept of IVF may be quite different. But in the ICSI situation, the pH had no effect on fertilization rate, no effect on the quality of the embryos, but it did suggest that overall there were slightly better embryos, there were more A grade and more embryos going to cryo storage. These weren't significant, but 0.013 tells you there is a trend there towards having more embryos that you could freeze. But the 3PN rate was a surprise and may well just be an artifact. It's probably this 0.09. And since everyone uses a 0.05 cutoff, they basically said there's no difference. But if I saw that, I would say that there is a trend. And one of 2 things will happen. If you double the sample size, these values may be the same, and the P will become highly significant. Or in fact, if you double the sample size, the difference may become less, and it's not irrelevant. But there is a suggestion that if you try and do ICSI at a lower pH, 7.2, your 3PN rate might be about 1% higher. Doesn't make much difference in the grand scheme of things. But since 3PN embryos are always discarded, well, they should be discarded, you may be introducing some little bias in your system by using your pH, which is far too low. But basically, you'll say here that of the 2, 7.3 might be a preferred pH range than 7.2. you're looking at the rate at which embryos dividing. I think these morphokinetic data is really interesting, although how you interpret it, I think is still up for debate. But the time of embryo fading is roughly the same. The time you get three cell is interesting because you have an embryo that divides into two, and then when the embryo divides into 3 to 4 cell stage, there's always one plasmid that divides first. So you always go through a 2 cell, 3 stage, 4 stage very quickly. And the time of going into the 3 stage is actually kind of how fast the embryo is processing, how much time it's taken to process all the sperm, etc., and get the apparatus of cleavage underway. And so there's no difference there, no difference the 4 cell stage, but there is this difference at the 5 cell stage. This is where you get the 4 cells, and then the next division goes 5, 6, 7, 8 really quickly. And after you get to 8, then you start to get compaction. And so the value of 0.08 here does suggest that the embryos are dividing just a little bit faster in lower pH, and the time from 3 stage to 5 cell stage, which is one of these metrics, does suggest 0.08 is not nothing. It just means it's not significant. And if you double the sample size, it may in fact become 0.05. And so you would tend to think that in fact there may be a trend here to suggest that the low pH, the embryos are dividing a little faster, even though overall they may not be as good a quality. And interestingly enough, there's a KID score. You get a KID score that gives you a value for day 3 and day 5. The KID one for 1 to 5 looks at a whole lot of factors. You've got no idea what it's looking at. It's just making all these decisions. And I think it's relating to the embryo, which then is put back and to give you a live birth. So the probability of a live birth is based on the KID score and based on presumably on day 3 transfers. And you can't really see much difference. There's not a lot of difference here, but your eye is drawn to the fact that there are more embryos that have a KID score 5, right, in the cytopenia. So my tendency, once again, is to think seriously, if you're running your incubator system at 7.2, maybe you need to discuss with your senior management or run a trial or something like they've done to see whether you're getting just a little bit better, more embryos or more pregnancies in 7.35, maybe. Look at the pregnancy rate. Having said that, we now, we now come back the other way, which is the nature of IVF. There's slightly more implantations for embryos are grown. There's a day 3 transfers, so there's 8 cells being put back. And there's just a couple of percentage points ahead with the lower pH. So even though you may have more embryos at the lower pH, they're dividing faster. They may not look as good. You may put more embryos in the freezer, but you're getting slightly better pregnancy rates, only about 3 or 4%, 0.19 is something that you would then want to keep tracking the data, add more and more data to it to see which way it goes. The miscarriage rate, although is a serious worry here, it's telling you a few more implantations, but more of these are miscarrying. 0.09 is not 0.05, but it's not meaningless. So once again, you don't actually know whether there's an effect or not, but there's enough a warning bell there for you to look at. No difference in the live birth rate, and no difference in the live birth per transfer. So my guess is there may be slightly more mosaicism or something like this. Mosaicism is an embryo culture phenomena rather than a fertilization chromosome phenomena. And so my guess is you're having slightly more miscarriages. It could be related to mosaicism. That's the primary, or they're not aneuploid, or it could be more aneuploidy. I don't know. But it does suggest that you may get more implantations. But in fact, at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is pregnancy rate, and it doesn't make any difference to pH. I think there's pluses and minuses. So my comments. Overall, there was little difference between the two pH environments. The authors state that rather than suggesting the absence of an effect, we state more precisely that no statistical significant difference was found in live birth rates was observed between the two pH conditions. I thought it was interesting that the 3PN rate, albeit low, and the miscarriage rate had probabilities approaching significance, suggesting that there may be differences in the euploid rate, but this wasn't part of the study. But other studies have looked at that, and I'll discuss that in my longer video when I get around to doing it in a couple of days. But indeed, if you actually take the numbers and double it, the pH becomes highly significant, even though statistically that's not what you're supposed to do. Well, the statisticians would jump down on me. But that's what I would do. I would double the rate and see whether the thing is different, and it is. So in reality, though, the study was constrained by the legal rules of using commercial media, and the difference was very marginal. They haven't really answered the question if there's any difference. I think it allows clinics to have some variability. Maybe it means that clinics can allow the pH range from 7.2 to 7.3 and not get worried about it if there's the variation between batches, etc. Or clinics can make a decision if they're going to, for instance, run a pH which is closer to 7.2 or closer to 7.4, and maybe in difference to maybe lower the miscarriage rate or something. But they did need to truncate the study due to factors outside, including COVID. And this is one of the sad part of that Chinese infection. In effect, they demonstrated that there are considerable range for CO2 settings that have little impact on live birth rate. Miscarriage rate less clear. And I think this is the takeaway message. This randomized control study demonstrated there was considerable range that you can run the CO2 without getting major problems. It's also getting really harder to perform a randomized controlled trial these days, and clinics can make decisions on which culture media to employ or to change from one source to another in the safe knowledge that a different pH will not impact on their success rates. In other words, one thing which I got out of it is if you're going to go from one culture media to another, which may have a slightly different operating pH, then I don't think I would be concerned about it. pH wouldn't be a reason for not moving to a different media. And the only comment I can make is that this only applies to ICSI cycles, since my IV cycles were not included. They may have different sensitivities to pH. So once again, I'd like to thank you for your time. My name's James Danger. I'm an embryologist with 50 years experience, get a bit long in the tooth. I'm not a medical person. This information, not medical advice, but it may help you knowing what questions to ask about your treatment with your doctor and maybe help you understand the advice you receive. So you may, if you're a client, you may like to come in and say, I saw this video on pH. What pH are you running your laboratory at? And just so that you know that they know what they're doing. If you like what I'm doing, you can press subscribe, press like, and you can tell other people how good this program is. But I have to say, this video is sponsored by my own company, FirdAid, which is an online thing at firdaid.com. It's an online EQA and training program in IVF for andrology and embryology. So I encourage everyone to look at that and consider using it. And I'd like to stop here. I'd like to thank you for your time. I know IVF is a personal journey that involves the action of many techniques, ideas, personnel, etc. And it helps to understand as many aspects of that journey as you can. I hope this information may have been of value. Tell others about this site. I'm trying to get more people, obviously. And I'd like to thank you for your time and say ciao.